Hi, everybody. Welcome to the latest episode of By the Way, it's Purposeful Procurement. My name is Philip Ideson. I'm the founder and managing director here at Art of Procurement, and I'm joined as my co-host, as always, by Rich Ham, CEO of Fine Tune. Rich, thank you for joining us.
Howdy, Phil. Nice to see you again.
Yeah, likewise. Looking forward to today's conversation. We're going to be joined by Martin Chilcott. Martin is founder of Manufacture 2030. We're going to talk a little bit about incentives and the role of decarbonization, which is something that's really important, has come out of these conversations so far. But before we do start, Martin, let me bring you in and welcome you to By the Way.
Thank you very much. Very great honor to be here. Very excited.
Thanks for joining us, Martin.
Now, I just wonder if you could just share for a little bit of context for our listeners, just a little bit about your background and about Manufacture 2030.
Sure. So I've been a serial entrepreneur all my life. Did stuff in the beginning of the end of the last century, the beginning of the noughties, with the web when it first came out, and in about, I guess, 2007, 2008, I got the climate bug. I suddenly saw the transition. I was introduced to some academics at Oxford University who basically said, look, this is the biggest transformation in the world's economy that's ever happened. Mm-hmm. Are you an entrepreneur, Martin? Are you going to be part of this, or are you going to stand on the sidelines and watch? And so I went to a whole series of lectures about the economics of climate change. And that I got the bug. And in 2008, we founded a company with my partners and I, and our backers founded a company called 2 Degrees Limited. And 2 Degrees Limited is still the parent company of Manufacture 2030. But at the time, we built a platform, a social media platform, to share best practices. And it was a bit like the LinkedIn without the jobs boards for sustainability professionals who were an emerging professional wave of people, class of people. In fact, Oliver Hurry, our mutual friend, ran a great chunk of that business at the time, and has now gone on with great success with the Scope 3 peer group, with much of the similar sort of sentiment, but without the technology, which he says suits him much better, he says. Anyway, we ran this business, and the interesting things about this business were we were using it for the likes of Tesco, with their top 1,000 suppliers, with Unilever, with Asda Walmart, with GlaxoSmithKline. And it was a social, as I said, it was a social technology, and we were surfacing best practices to share amongst the suppliers. The philosophy behind it was that if you took a large group of suppliers in a supply chain, that 80% of all the problems that they might face around sustainability will have been solved somewhere in that supply chain if you can find out who solved it and you can surface it and share it. So we did that all the way through to about 2018, but we never got the business model quite to work, and it was expensive without today's modern AI technology. Without that technology, it was expensive finding those who had made the breakthroughs and surfacing them. So in 2018, we took all the lessons we'd learned in all of those programs for that 10-year period, and we pivoted the business. And we said, right, firstly, we've got to focus on manufacturing. Secondly, it's got to be much more data-driven and much more measurable. Thirdly, it's got to be less serendipitous. It's got to be more structured, and we've got to meet the needs, the growing needs at that time, the large corporations had, of needing to address climate change through reporting and structured reductions in Scope 3, as opposed to the kind of serendipitous kind of surfacing that we'd had in the way. So we launched, and where are we now? 50 global manufacturing or global corporations with manufacturing supply chains, 88 countries around the world. I think the suppliers are in, well over 10,000 facilities part of the program. So the pivot went well.
Yeah. Do you find that the companies are willing to work, who may consider themselves as traditionally competitors within an industry, that sustainability is something that kind of transcends that and is not necessarily just seen as an arms race for competitive advantage, but something that has to be solved, with some of these companies you talked about who are competitors in the space, actually working together to address problems around sustainability and emissions?
Yeah, look, what you just said, I think is absolutely true. Though I have to say some of the fiercest competitors tend to ask us to keep them a little bit at arm's length.
Mm-hmm.
And we do, and I won't mention names, but there are some really very fierce ones out there, aren't there? And we do have to play an honest broker role to enable people to collaborate. But it is true, I think, that the people who have sort of titles such as, kind of sustainable procurement or sustainable supply chain, people coming from that world are naturally collaborative, I think. They recognize that this is a problem of the commons, and we all need to solve it. You can't actually solve it entirely on your own. And because modern supply chains are so overlapping, aren't they?
Yeah.
Some people have vertically integrated exclusive supply chains to a certain level, but in reality, the vast majority of them are overlapping. And so, GM's supply chain will be 30% Ford's, even if the, Magna as a supplier will be supplied from a different facility. So you've got this enormous overlay. And if every single corporation, every customer or buyer went to that supply base with individual approaches that weren't in any way coordinated, the overhead of administration for the suppliers would be horrendous. I mean, it's bad enough as it is, but it would be absolutely horrendous. And I think they would not participate. There'd be a revolution.
Yeah. Now, one of the things we like to do in the project is really highlight examples of purposeful procurement. And I know that with a number of the companies that you're working with through Manufacture 2030, you're seeing some really good examples of procurement teams, of procurement leaders driving some meaningful change when it comes to addressing sustainability challenges. I just wonder if there's one or two that you may be able to share with us just to give us a little bit of inspiration.
Yeah, well, look, I think there's lots. Obviously, I could talk about loads, but let me take one group. I'm going to take our pharma clients, the likes of GSK, AstraZeneca, Pfizer, UBS, BMS, take Takeda, take that as a group, who are all collaborating together to focus on the area of emissions in their supply chain, which is most intense, which is in the active pharmaceutical ingredient manufacturers. And in there, you've got the production of solvents and the use of solvents in the production of the active pharmaceutical ingredient, which requires the production of those solvents requires large amounts of fossil fuel and very high temperatures. And they are working together with that group to set common standards and objectives. We, the world's largest pharma companies, all require change in this area. We're here to support you. They're providing knowledge and information to make it easier for them, and they're engaging them on programs. So we're beginning to see a change in awareness and capability in that supply base. So that's a kind of really great example of collaboration, I think, addressing a big problem. The other couple of good ones I think would be, and I think this is a good segue into what we're going to talk about, are really about how some companies in particular are beginning to look at carbon as a commercial cost and how they're integrating that in different ways into their programs. So we've got Haleon, the manufacturers of Advil, who are running their RFP processes now, asking the suppliers participating to produce a product carbon footprint, and then they're applying the EU's emissions trading scheme price of carbon to that footprint. They're taking what you might call the traditional cost of goods plus the cost of the carbon, rolling it up together as a total cost of ownership, and they're running the RFP against that total cost of ownership. And that means they're beginning to really embed carbon at the center, the heart of procurement's role and the relationship between buyers and suppliers. So that's really impressive. And then you've got other people who are at the other end of the spectrum doing it in a completely different way. They have long-term relationships with their suppliers, and they are building in longer-term performance management as part of the long-term contract. So Jaguar Land Rover is a really good example, but there are several others in the automotive world that are similarly doing it. But so you've got 4-year plus contracts, and in the setting of those contracts, you've got reduction glide paths that have to be met as part of the contract, that are rewarded if they're met or exceeded, and they are penalized if they're not. And so that two very contrasting ways of doing it, but both of them really beginning to have impressive results in how they're addressing and changing attitudes, both in the buying organization and in the supplier organization.
Martin, I want to dive deeper into this discussion of costs and kind of the way that the term is defined, also the definition of the term savings and how that may work against progress in your world. But before we do, two things. First, I want to say to our listeners, they should really take a moment to look up M2030. I have sat through sessions with some of Martin's leaderships and some of the world's largest manufacturers, and they're really doing amazing work. And you don't have to take Martin's or his leadership's words for it. You can take it from their customers who seem to sing their praises every time I sit in on one of their sessions. So amazing company. The question I want to ask you, Martin, before we dive deeper is, when we first described this project to you, that we were on this journey of exploring whether there were certain flaws in the systems of incentivization and measurement within the world of corporate procurement. And we kind of knew that these flaws often were a hindrance to optimal P&L related behavior, but we approached it also with the theory, at least, that these same flaws in the system might also be often a hindrance to much needed investment in more sustainable business, decarbonization, energy efficiency, et cetera. What was your reaction when you heard about the project? And do you think we're on the right track?
I think you're absolutely on the right track. Attempts to really integrate an understanding of carbon and an understanding of how you reduce carbon and risk and associated costs has been hampered, I think, very largely by the fact that corporate response has started off from a compliance and investor relations perspective. And because we've started off there, we've looked at carbon as a compliance type risk, which sits alongside the commercial relationship, but is not integral to the commercial relationship. And unless we can find ways of saying both the value of saving emissions, reducing emissions, and recognizing the cost of emissions that are not saved, if we can't do those two things and integrate them into the commercial relationship between buyer and supplier, we are always going to be struggling to really drive that agenda forward. It'll always be the poor cousin against quality, against price, and against delivery. And it probably appears fourth or fifth on the list. And this is really apparent in our conversations with suppliers when, supplier pushes back and says, I don't want to be part of the process. And we say, why? And they say, well, I spoke to my category manager. My category manager said, it's just not important. Keep focusing on quality, price, and delivery. So if we can't reinterpret and understand carbon as part of quality, why is a low carbon product a high quality product? And how do we understand carbon as a cost? It's a bit like Halion are doing on their RFPs, or Jaguar Land Rover are doing it, and understanding it as a cost to the business and a risk to the business. If we can do those things, we can integrate it into quality and cost. If we can do that, then you can bring it to the heart of the commercial relationship. And you bring it into procurement's purview, don't you? So procurement really can take on ownership of Scope 3 and really attack it and have the weapons to do so.
It sounds like before we even get to incentives, we have a problem with the definition of terms. And if we could dive a little deeper into cost, I think you would argue, if I'm not mistaken, but I don't want to assume, that whether businesses account for carbon emissions in their supply chain as a cost or not, the truth is they are a cost today. And maybe you could educate our listeners a little bit and offer an example or two of how emissions in a supply chain are indeed today a cost.
Yeah, well, they have been growing for a number of years. They're a real cost. I mean, just at a really high level, Antonio Perez, the UN's climate chief, came out, I think just yesterday or the day before, this week anyway, basically saying if we have to get climate change under control if we're to create economic stability again. So they've done a load of work at the UN on the economic impacts across the piece, the global economy, and it's absolutely clear to them. So if you drop down that from that high level position, you get to really striking individual examples. So I'll give you a couple. So one is the Panama Canal. The water levels in the Panama Canal are dropping. that means the amount of shipping that goes through it is slowing down, which affects the logistics, actually leads to bottlenecks where things don't get through, which affects particularly industrial supply chains, which adds cost. It's a real cost. Without a shadow of doubt, the climate is reducing rainfall, which is reducing water levels, which is reducing throughput of traffic and logistics. At the most extreme end, I think you look at agriculture. I don't think there is probably an agricultural region in the world that is not being affected by climate change. The most striking one that I think brings it home is around cocoa. We all love chocolate, don't we? We all love chocolate. Most of the chocolate is produced in West Africa, and the weather in West Africa has been getting steadily more and more extreme. I think it was in 2023, the rainfall in West Africa was double the 30-year average. And the extreme weather events there are getting more and more frequent. In fact, that weather rainfall, that huge flooding was followed by then very severe drought. So that by the end of 2024, just to give you an idea of how that leads through to pricing, cocoa prices, commodity prices for cocoa had gone up 400% over 2023. And in the UK, I know the UK price because I went to buy chocolate. The consumer was paying 40% more for the chocolate, and the size of chocolate bars was being reduced to deal with reduction in supply. So look, I mean, it's really dramatic. You look at wine production in Spain. There, I can't remember which particular bottler it was, but one of the fairly mainstream, well-known brands just the other week was talking about the fact they were going to have to uproot all their vines and move all of them to higher grounds into cooler latitudes where there was better irrigation and more water. And in fact, I mean, this is agriculture gets hit hard directly, but you think then of all of the manufacturing that is dependent upon agricultural produce, they all get affected by it. So these are real costs.
We may tolerate the hurricanes and the wildfires, but when it starts affecting our chocolate and our Rioja, somewhere along the line, you have to draw the line somewhere. Phil, I think you had a follow-up question for Martin.
Yeah, I have a couple actually. I'm interested to know, kind of in your experience, how many businesses actually recognize these as being costs. Like we talk about the situations, and we feel those when we go to the store. We can understand what the lack of access to the Panama Canal does on global supply chains. How do companies care? How many companies care? Is it industry by industry?
Yes.
Is there becoming a growing kind of understanding that there is a connection between carbon and cost?
Yes, I mean, it's a great question. And you're absolutely right. It is to a degree industry by industry. And I think that the public discourse is colored by some industries, particularly the kind of petroleum industries, distortion of the airways. So very often when we hear about business thinks that or business thinks the other, actually what they're talking about is lobbying groups that are paid for largely by the petroleum industry. If you exclude oil and gas from companies you survey, you get very strong awareness of the growing risks, and those risks are getting more and more important. So I think it was the European Central Bank did a survey in about 22 or 23, so a couple of years ago, but not very long ago, and they spoke to a bunch of very large corporations, asking them about whether they recognize the growing cost of climate change. And I think 90% of them said yes. Yeah. So it gives you an idea that they're aware of it. I think the challenge for business is not actually saying there is a risk and there is a cost here. It's about how do you put a number on that, and how do you integrate it into the way a business processes and works. I think that's where the challenge comes from. And I think of the 90% that said yes, they recognize it, and I'm going to be slightly off on my numbers here, but approximately something like 2/3 of them saw the risks as being to do with the transition, that these were largely carbon intensive industries, cement, manufacturing, cars or whatever. And they saw that transition as being a cost and a risk. But if they didn't transition, then there was a cost and a risk about fines and, reputation and all sorts of other things. So it was kind of both the things they had to invest in and do, but also the cost of not doing. And then about just under 50% of them saw it as direct climate change. So disruption to the supply chain, like the Panama Canal example, or disruption to agriculture, or little things that just add up, like tarmac. You can't lay tarmac over a certain temperature. The kind of that temperature is right. We get more days when construction companies can't lay tarmac than ever before. That's a cost.
Yeah, affects infrastructure.
Yeah, exactly. And days in which operating a factories is just particularly in developing economies where maybe the kind of air conditioned quality isn't quite so good, that it's just not, they have to stop working. So whether it's agriculture or it's industry or it's logistics, people are seeing this directly. And I say it was just under 50%, I think, who were saying we can point to examples where our business is being negatively financially impacted.
Which is encouraging, that number, I'm sure, is ever increasing. I think back to something you said earlier, and I'm putting my procurement hat on here. You talked about total cost of ownership. If we think about it from a procurement perspective, where when we're thinking about costs, we're also embedding the cost of carbon as we're looking at making decisions. When we're looking at savings, we're thinking about how much did we save, including, as you talked about, the example where you're going and using an RFP to understand costs of carbon emissions, where we're tracking savings saved on that. If we were to start embedding that into our incentive structure, how much of a difference do you think that would make?
Well, I think it would make a massive difference in the management of value across the supply chain. And the reason why I think it make a big difference, without doing that, it's very difficult to communicate to the supplier that reducing carbon is worth the effort. Okay, and I'm going to come back to those words. Reducing carbon is worth the effort. At the moment, for most suppliers, unless they have some other internal driver, let's say they're a large public company themselves and they've got investors and they've got other drivers, or they're in a position where they're acutely affected by climate change. Without those two dimensions to it, for most suppliers, even though reducing emissions is not that difficult, it is not worth the effort because they're not being rewarded. Okay, I don't get more. Very good example. I won't mention who the company is, but a really great company doing amazing things have admitted to me that they are deselecting suppliers, indirect suppliers, if they do not sign up to science-based targets and get on the journey to reduce them. But they are not yet prepared to do that with direct suppliers that lead into the products that they sell. So businesses that are in this real bind, that the crude deselection tool, the big mallet that says I can deselect you, is not really a tool that can be used by buyers with direct suppliers comfortably. They can do it with indirects, but they struggle to do it with directs. So you really have to move away from the kind of compliance, black and white, you're in, you're out, you're selected, you're deselected. And you need to be more nuanced when you deal with direct suppliers. You need to put more emphasis not on deselection, but you need to put much more emphasis on doing more business with us. So we need to develop a toolkit of incentives and processes to manage and deploy those incentives to encourage the right behaviors. So you've got, as we mentioned earlier, Jaguar Land Rover as an example, the automotive industry and others with long-term contracts and contract performance management. You've got Halion and Lego and others with shorter-term contracts using total cost of ownership in RFPs. But we've also got other tools. We could improve payment terms. We could provide access to trade finance. And if you hit certain targets at certain levels of carbon reduction, you get lower interest rates. So I think Asda, the supermarket, doing that, for instance. We can extend length of contract times. We recognize that there's this particular project you've got. If you can implement that project, you'll be reducing your emissions to us by, big figure, 20% or something. So you'll really help us with our numbers. Okay, but we recognize that's a 4-year return for you. So we'll go 3/4 of the way. We'll give you a 3-year contract rather than a 1-year contract, treble the length of your contract, and in order to encourage you, so your risk is reduced just to that final 1 year. So there are lots of things in the toolkit that we can build that I think will make it worth the effort for the supplier. But we really do have to focus on that. It's about time we put more effort into focusing on engaging suppliers, motivating, incentivizing suppliers, and probably less time on the reporting.
As a side note, here I would note, forgive me for cutting you off there, Martin. Sorry about that. I want to note that this threat of lost business that you talk about, the hammer of deselection, I don't want to go down this rabbit hole today, Phil, but let's put a pin in that thought, because I think there's a very interesting thread in this whole discussion on consolidation of power within industries among fewer and fewer players. I think there is an antitrust and anti-monopoly thread that needs to be explored here, because it's harder and harder to wield that threat of deselection when there's only 2 options or 3 options in a given industry.
Provide upside incentives. It has to be driven by upside incentives, not downside. Well, there's also, and you touched very quickly, and it's a rabbit hole, and you've got a pin on it, but it really is an interesting subject.
It is.
There's also a real danger that you drive inflation. That you end up with you cut out 30% of your supply chain, but it's not just you doing it. Remember, I said you share 30% of your supply base with your competitors. You cut out your 30%, they cut out 30%. Everybody cuts out 30%. You get squeezed down, and it's going to be less than 70% that you get squeezed down by. And everybody wants supply from the same people. And so therefore it's inevitable that increased demand, reduced supply will lead to higher prices. We can't allow that to happen.
No, of course not. We've talked a lot about these critical terms, cost and savings, and the role that they play in a better future state. I also don't want to lose sight of the fact that there are certain kind of rather arbitrary systems of measurement that I think also tend to work against decarbonization and investment in energy efficiency. And a couple episodes back, we talked with a brilliant woman named Kate Vitasic who talked about how the present state of incentives and incentive structures within corporate procurement has produced a scourge of short-termism, where everything runs through the prism of what happens in the next 12 months, that magical increment of time, 365 days. Martin, we have a 12-month problem as it relates to the P&L. I have to think we also have one as it relates to investment in decarbonization. How often in your world does an initiative look like a loser over the first 12 months, but is actually a winner over a 3 to 5 year horizon?
I would say for the vast majority of projects, particularly once you get beyond the low-hanging fruit, you're talking a 3-year horizon. Now, there's a lot of stuff. If you're really new at this, and you are, the average manufacturing company, and your non-labor resource efficiency gains are bouncing around at 1 to 2% per annum. Actually, you've got an awful lot of just straightforward, let's get efficient with our, let's deal with compressed air leak inspections and, cut that back. And you've got really just run my factory better kind of things. And those do tend to have a 1 to 2 year horizon, and they can be accelerated, and that's good. But you get to a point where, that low-hanging fruit's been used up. And then you are talking 3 to 5 years. And I don't think this is just a problem for the supplier. I think it's a problem for the buyer. I think it's a problem for the buyer's investors. I think in many ways what you can look at, people talk about it's going to cost. It costs. Reducing emissions costs money. It doesn't cost money. Fundamentally, ultimately, it's about doing more with less. And that should be, it doesn't take much to say that should be cheaper. But it does require investment to get to that point. And the biggest difference between what I would say is climate enlightened investors, whether that's financial investors or that's, the corporation itself, is the time horizon. And we need much more innovation from finance companies to create new mechanisms that extend that kind of relationship. So it's a really good example of this in company we partner with in the States called Renew Energy Partners, wonderful company. They provide off-balance sheet funding for asset upgrades and on-site renewables. So you want to change your HVAC system, you want to put solar panels in or whatever it is. And the funding mechanism is such that you don't actually ever buy the kit. So you don't worry about the return on the capital investment because you make no capital investment. You immediately start making the savings because your HVAC system is 80% more efficient than your old one, or your boiler is. So you make very significant savings on energy consumption right from the upset on the asset upgrade. And of course, you're generating your own electricity. You pay for them. I mean, it's not part of the contract, but you pay them a monthly/yearly amount, and that goes out over a kind of 5 or 7 year period, where what happens at the end of that period varies by contract to contract. But in nearly all cases, certainly all cases that get taken up, the amount you're saving or the amount of energy you're generating and therefore not buying is greater than your payments to them. And we need that kind of energy as a services innovation to break this short-term problem we have. Is this short-term or is it long-term? And this goes for contracts, coming back to how can you incentivize suppliers? If you've got a good supplier and they're good enough for a 1-year contract, use the opportunity of extending the length of the contract to get them to do the other things that are reducing your cost and risk.
Martin, if we were to wave a magic wand and change the increment of time over which procurement professionals tend to be measured, i.e. 12 months, and just make it 36 or 60, if all of a sudden year over year became half decade over half decade, how significant an impact would that one change make on the pace of decarbonization work globally?
I think that would make a massive difference. Absolutely make a massive difference. I think it's huge, absolutely huge. Yeah, well, no doubt about it. The other thing to get there, I think the bit that we've not touched on this conversation yet, but I think is highly relevant, is that procurement doesn't work in isolation. Procurement's framework for action tends to be set by finance and by the lines of business. And so in talking to all of our procurement clients, one of the things that is really apparent is the awareness, particularly of the lines of business, the brand or the commercial guys, the business, their understanding of the risks and the costs of carbon is not nearly sophisticated enough. And so they tend to set traditional narrow frameworks in which procurement can operate. So they need to be better educated. And then at the same time, finance is, the finance department will be the people at the end of the day who say, this is your toolkit for financial incentives for the suppliers. To be able to build that toolkit, they need to be much better educated. So there is this cross-pollination of the lines of business, of procurement and of finance, which we just need to focus on in order to do the kinds of things you're saying, which is extend contract lengths.
So I know it's almost time for us to wrap up, but I'm reminded as you said that the comment that you made earlier that I wrote down because it was impactful to me is reducing carbon, is it worth the effort? And so it's only worth the effort if you understand what you're saving or what you're mitigating, protecting. Yeah. And if you don't know that as a line of business, then it's probably going to be much harder as a procurement professional to influence folks on is it worth the effort or not. So I just wonder if we could leave with kind of any tips you have for procurement leaders who are listening on how do they help kind of influence folks within the organization who may not see that it's worth the effort to understand that it truly is?
Well, I think it's quite hard work, to be honest. But it is the job of these new hybrid sustainable procurement folk, I think, to educate, to go back to the lines of business, to talk to the right people. I think there are two levels. It's not just what is the cost, what is the risk and the cost. Lay that out very clearly of carbon. But I think you could also equally focus on quality. Really work with them to help them understand how a lower carbon product adds value to their offering. In what situations, which brands, what lines of business is that obvious? And really, so you can work both with them on the quality end and on the cost end. It's interesting that I am currently working alongside M2030 on a consulting offering, which is looking at how can you bring these three groups of people together into workshops where they work through these problems together to create a common understanding. They all have the same directive from the board that this is important and you must do something about it. But it breaks down when it gets down into the lines of business, into finance, and therefore that cripples procurement's ability to deal with it. So how do we bring those people together and get them to work through this nuggety little problem?
We are going to be considering that as we build our kind of doctoral thesis on this topic at the end of our project here, something we'll be publishing for all our listeners to come and use as they see fit. And Martin, we are going to take you up on your offer to at least consult with you along the way a little bit when that time comes. We really and thank you so much. You've been generous with your time today. I know our listeners are going to love this episode. I want to and we'll get you out of here after this last question, but I want to try to offer some inspiration to our listeners, since the topic is ultimately purposeful procurement and trying to arrive at a future state where the function becomes more purposeful. Is there any field in the entire world, if we think separate from nation states, but rather just disciplines in the working world, is there any field with more power to influence decarbonization and ultimately climate change than corporate purchasing?
I think corporate purchasing are the heroes of the climate fight that we're facing. They're the unsung heroes. And why do I say that? As I say that because most of the emissions are generated by corporations. Most of the emissions of corporations are in scope 3. Most of that scope 3 is upstream. Hey presto, it's in the wheelhouse of procurement. Procurement professionals who understand this as a cost and risk to their business in the short, medium, and ultimately existentially in the long term, have an opportunity to make changes which are going to affect generations, going to affect their kids, their lives and livelihoods, going to affect, how the world and society and civilization pans out over the next 10, 20, 30, 40 years. So they are in heroic roles, unsung, quiet, undemonstrative people as they very often are. They are absolutely the heroes of the fight against climate change.
Phil, I think Martin Chilcott just dropped the mic.
There you go. Well, if anybody has heard that and they want to know how they can get involved, if they can learn a little bit more about Manufacture 2030, where would be a good place for them to go?
Well, they go to our website, manufacture2030.com. That would be a good starting point. Or they could drop me an email, martinchilcott@manufacture2030.com. I'd be delighted to, as long as I'm not totally outdated, I'd be delighted to take up and pass them on to the right places.
All right. Well, Martin, I want to thank you so much for joining Rich and I today. We really appreciate it.
Thank you so much, Martin.
Really
Thank you.
It's great what you're doing, guys. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.